easily into the suitcase of the job seeker. But the spiritual life is infinitely more subtle. Often that's what we leave behind us. The spiritual life is tied by, as it were, 1,000 almost invisible filaments to the particularities, to the cultural life of historically rooted Muslim communities. It's linked to our traditional landscape of mosques, of tombs, of family ceremonials and customs. And those are the things that, when we come to the West, we are usually torn away from. Hence, the Muslim, as he or she arrives at a British or American or Australian airport, contemplating a new life on very unfamiliar, alien ground, can sometimes be, as it were, thrown off balance religiously by the very fact of having made hijrah, of having moved. Some newcomers can have an inexorable tendency, and we've all seen them, towards the outward aspects of religion, and often find it hard to locate a context and a language for the reconnection with the spirit. So importing the form of religion is easy when you travel, but importing the content, the spirit of religion, tends to be a lot more difficult. And that's why so many Muslim organizations in the West tend to be a little bit dry, exoteric, harsh, intolerant. And the Milad is a very important case in point. The arguments for the Milad, while they have well-known and defensible Sharia foundations, are ultimately intuitive. They're arguments of the heart, not of the mind. Every traditional Muslim harbors in his or her heart a love, mahabba, for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which, given the fitrah of human beings, naturally seeks to express itself in poetry, in song, in the narration of the seerah, and generally in an event which every year expresses the principle that it's an obligation to celebrate blessings, and there is no blessing conferred upon humanity since Adam greater than the coming into the world of the seal of the prophets, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So in our modern dislocated context, as we grope for a way of being Muslim in a new, unfamiliar world, where issues settled by happy tradition, like the madhabs, like the milad, like so many other familiar parts of the Muslim heritage, are now being opened up once again for scrutiny, for argument and controversy. The despiritualizing of life, which often seems to come with the process of moving from a traditional Muslim culture to a minority experience in the West, has skewed the whole debate and the whole nature of Muslim expression in the West in an outward, dry, exoteric dimension. Arguments amongst Muslim organizations in the West, for the most part, tend to be on the level of form of religion, the level of Islam with a small I, as it were, sometimes of Iman, almost never does one hear serious discussions of ihsan. So the religion is unbalanced in favor of the divisive possibilities of its outward forms, because the heart unifies and the law creates not disunity but diversity. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of fiqh dalils, each of which can be variously interpreted and provide scope for disagreement. But there is only one heart, and its argument, the dalil, is only ever one. It's the argument that clamours for serenity, for dhikr, for remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the only dalil that the heart has in religion. So once the spiritual life is cultivated, the relative nature of the lesser distinctions and arguments of fiqh become very clear, and the way is open for a tolerance of diversity and unity around the only possible source of unity, namely the life of the heart. And the Sufis have always been aware of this, of the unitive possibilities of the Sufi way. So the famous Spanish Sufi Ibn al-Banna as-Saraqusti says, عباراتنا شتى وحسنك واحد وكل إلى ذاك الجمال يشير. The way we express things is very varied, but your beauty is one, and we are all pointing towards that same beauty. That's the nature of Sufism, because it's pointing towards the one. It is the unitive force within Islam. Now, once we've recovered this perspective and got it clear in our minds, it immediately becomes plain what's wrong with many of our Muslim communities here in the West. We've often imported the husk and we've left the kernel behind. And this is why it is the Sufis who are the natural bearers to the West of the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and particularly those Sufi tariqas such as the Sada Naqshbandiya, who have such a distinguished and blessed record throughout their history of bringing Islam to communities which previously sat in darkness. And it's the Sufi responsibility precisely because as Sufis we have got our priorities right. The hadith of Jibreel that we all know, one of the most fundamental hadiths of Islam, establishes not just a division between the three categories of Islam, Iman and Ihsan, but it also insists that one stands above the other. One progresses from Islam, from the outward form, to Iman, to Ihsan, from form to mental assent, and then to spiritual realization and experience. And it is in the reverse order of these dimensions that we need to present the message of our faith to outsiders, and also to the very many doubtful Muslims and to our children. Further aspect of this is that Muslim communities in the West need to cultivate even more respect for indigenous flowerings of Islam. Very often we see people from the traditional Muslim world regarding themselves as somehow superior to or even in charge of the African American Muslims, who are such an important and rapidly growing feature on the Muslim landscape here. However, precisely because those Muslims have not experienced the despiritualization that can sometimes accompany the migration process, we may expect them often to be spiritually and hence intrinsically more whole than most people who are dealing with the problems of an acculturation. We need, I think, to be very frank about that. Sometimes we marginalize them, and they deserve much more than that. So once we've established in our minds, as the traditional ulama always affirmed, the primacy of ihsan over the other registers of the deen, and we've acknowledged that the experience of being plunged into the deep end of modernity here in a place like America is very corrosive of the spiritual life, more corrosive of the spiritual life than it is of the mental life or of the moral life. We can begin to ask ourselves the question precisely what it means in a modern minority context, as Muslims fumbling for an identity in a modern industrial society in whose creation we had no hand, to be attached to the way of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In what sense do the Sunnah and the Seerah and love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam function for us as norms and as simple patterns which give meaning